Hi, everybody. We are excited to be here at DataStack Summit talking more about Presto. Quick introduction, I'm Allie Leclerc. I'm chair of the Presto Foundation Outreach Committee, and I will be moderating today's panel. With me, I have Tim and Girish. So Tim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Tim Meehan, software engineer at Meta, focusing on Presto. Also the TSC chair for the Presto Foundation.
Hey, Ali. I'm Girish Baliga. I'm a senior engineering manager at Uber. And I'm also chair of the governing board for the Presto Foundation.
Great. So like you probably saw in the title, we are here today to talk about Presto and specifically how we're seeing people use Presto to build modern data architectures, specifically for the Open Data Lakehouse. So why don't we just jump right in here? Let's talk about today's kind of modern data architecture. Both of you are working for, pretty forward-thinking companies that are doing really innovative things. So, as we see companies like Uber and Meta and even smaller companies moving to kind of what we're calling the modern data architecture today, what are some of the challenges? Maybe Tim, we can start with you that you're seeing, maybe Meta or other companies face as they're looking to modernize their stacks.
I think some of the common challenges center around cost and scalability. At a high level, what you want to do is you want to unlock the full potential of your data, and you want to use it for maybe purposes that you can't plan for. This unlocks a lot of other business value, but it also makes you take a hard look at the way that you're managing the data, and then also the way that you're scaling. I think the need for horizontal scalability is really important, costs drive a lot of the decision making.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something there, scalability. Girish, I'll send it over to you because I know Uber talks a lot about the scale they're running and how, specifically how Presto helps address that. But in general, maybe we can start with, at Uber, you're running things at like massive scale. What were some of the challenges that you had as a data infrastructure team, and how have you kind of been moving out of those challenges and moving to this modern data architecture?
Yeah, great questions. So first to clarify, Facebook runs at an even bigger scale than us. So that's one of the main reasons we are using Presto, is because it's tried and tested at their scale. But to add to the points that Tim raised, in addition to scalability and cost, one of the other things that we really love about Presto at Uber is that it's reliable, right? And this becomes increasingly important as you hit scale. So the more machines you have, the higher likelihood that one of them is going to have a failure ever so often, right? And if you have an equal probability of failure for all the machines, you can see how the math works out, that you're probably going to see a lot of failures much of the time. And so it's very important to have a reliable system, right? A system that can scale, a system that can handle failures and things like that. And so this is why, especially in the open source space, it's very valuable to be able to develop and test features, not just in terms of functionality and optimality, but also reliability. So that, the issues that probably don't show up at a lot of the scale that people use will definitely show up at Facebook and Uber scale.
That's right. So moving into the title of our session, the Open Data Lakehouse, I think the term, data lakehouse has certainly taken on a life of its own over the past few months. And we're certainly seeing it from a Presto perspective, a lot more companies and users leveraging Presto for the Open Data Lakehouse. And so while we talk about this, I'm just going to share kind of our perspective on what the Open Data Lakehouse is. And we're seeing a lot of restraints or constraints, I should say, around the data warehouse. And so this Open Data Lakehouse approach is really this next evolution of the modern data stacks. So of course we talk about Presto. You see Presto right smack dab in the middle as the SQL query engine for the data lakehouse. But really the value proposition around the lakehouse, you have open formats, you have open source, open cloud. It's kind of giving you the best of both worlds here with a data lake that allows you to store all types of data. You can run open formats on top of that data lake. And then you also get the ability to run warehouse type workloads on the Open Data Lakehouse. And again, we'll talk about Presto because we all are part of the Presto Foundation, but from a high level, this is what we're seeing from a market perspective. And so, Tim, why don't we go back to you? I mean, kind of based on your experience at Meta and what you're seeing in the market when it comes to the data lakehouse, does this line up, and what are the trends that you're kind of seeing come up quite a bit?
Yeah, I think it definitely lines up both with, like what people, sort of like get value out of Presto, or how people find value out of Presto, both within, Meta, and then also how I've, through my discussions with other companies as well. It, sort of like centers around, like a very scalable data lake, very scalable storage, and providing a very fast SQL processing layer on top of that, to really unlock the value, through this scalable data lake. And sort of like I think this graph does a good job of sort of like explaining how things fit together. And so the reporting and dashboarding for sure is something that Presto is very good at, but then also like we're continuing to improve Presto so that it continues to scale as the data lake scales, as Girish mentioned. Like we're sort of like already running at a very large scale deployment, but like we're continuing to push the envelope in that direction. And then also like enabling more and more use cases, so that Presto is the first tool that you reach for in this area.
That's right. And I should mention, some of the challenges that we're seeing being solved for in the Open Data Lakehouse stack, especially as compared to the traditional more data warehouse sort of stack, is much more flexibility. Again, the open data formats, you can plug and play any engine. We're talking about Presto, but that doesn't mean it's only limited to Presto. And then running your ML and AI workloads. And we think that the future is moving to that direction. So giving folks the ability to run those workloads at some point in the future, we call future proofing, is going to become more critical. And so that's really what we're seeing from an HANA and Presto Foundation perspective. But Girish, I'll pass it over to you. Anything else to add kind of from your perspective?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things we've seen at Uber is that people love Presto because it's simple. And I think that's a very underrated aspect about Presto. So especially when you're hitting scale, it's really hard to build programs that can process data in volumes that we would like to analyze, right? So if you're talking about gigabytes, you can probably write a program to do it. If you're talking about terabytes, you're probably going to start hitting limits. But then when you're starting to talk about petabytes, and you're starting to talk about thousands of users accessing your system at the same time, it really boils down to how simple you can make your interface to your users, right? And SQL is the proven simple interface in this domain. It's a lot simpler to write SQL queries. Lots of people can write SQL queries. You don't need to be a software engineer. Most data scientists know how to do it. And that is the power that Presto brings, right? So you can replace your complex MapReduce pipelines by a few SQL queries, and it'll run just fine on small data sets, big data sets. It'll run on all the formats, all the different storages that you can support in different companies. And as you move around, right? So as folks move around different use cases, different companies, even the skill set that you're taking with you, the ability to operate with Presto SQL becomes more and more valuable.
Great. So now that we've talked about the Open Data Lakehouse, I think I've said this several times, but I'll just reinforce it. Presto is what has brought us all together today. So obviously we're all very heavily invested in Presto. So maybe Tim, we can start. Can you just give us a high level on what Presto actually is?
Yeah, and so I think I can, in one sentence we can, encapsulate everything. There's a lot to unpack, but in one sentence, Presto is a fast, open source distributed SQL query engine that accesses data through pluggable connectors. So there's a lot, I think, to this that I think is important to highlight. The first is the speed. One of Presto's defining features is its interactive nature and the ease of use. Submitting a query through Presto is quick, both in terms of sort of like the startup time and like the time to first byte. It just emphasizes very fast execution. It does this through lots of different techniques, including efficient execution, efficient SQL operators, and intelligent caching. The second is open source. So it's a fast open source distributed SQL query engine. It kind of talked about, I think, like the whole open aspect of the Open Data Lake, but it's very important for this project, also to be open source because, sort of like this, it makes it so that it removes biases and, sort of like makes it agnostic as to what data format or table layout, what ends up being, sort of like popular. Presto is agnostic to these things and tends to work just fine for whatever it happens to be. Even if it's not sort of like it could even be relational databases or other or similar things. Distributed. So Presto executes queries at scale, as Girish, I think, sort of like thoughtfully mentioned. The reliability and latency of Presto is improved by the distributed execution. So that parallelism really sort of like, it kind of adds to the speed aspect, but also the reliability and the dependability of Presto. SQL, Presto has sort of like a SQL front end, and Girish also touched upon this, but I think like the SQL interface is very important because it's a standards-based interface. You don't have to relearn, sort of like any different sort of like data frames format or something similar. It's the same, sort of like SQL dialect that traditional data warehousing tools use and more other engines that are out there, which means that there's less rewrite, less, sort of like having to learn all the nuances and semantics of something different. So that's very important. And then the last part I mentioned, I think, was the pluggable connectors. And so I think this part is finally important. It also ties into the openness and, the fact that Presto doesn't take a strong stance on, where you put your data. Presto is designed to, sort of like scale to your needs and, be a consistent front end to all of your data infrastructure. So that was in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And I'll just add, maybe from a use case level, some of the more common use cases that we see Presto being used for today. Obviously, we mentioned the BI and dashboarding, right? Fantastic for those kinds of workloads, ad hoc queries. Data Lakehouse analytics is what we're talking a lot about today, and then federated queries, right? So one of the big value propositions of Presto is that you can query data where it lives. You don't need to move or copy your data over, and that's pretty huge to be able to do that. So from a use case perspective, I think that's what we're seeing most folks using Presto for today. So Girish, I'll pass it over to you as chair of the Presto Foundation. We mentioned Presto is an open source project housed by the Linux Foundation. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the Presto Foundation and why that's important for an open source project.
Yeah, so the Presto Foundation represents a community, right? I think that's where it starts. It's the community that comes together to use Presto as the standard SQL engine that they deploy to their customers and their end users in their various use cases and deployments. So that's where it starts. It starts with the community. The foundation mainly is structured so that we are inclusive of both the long tail of engineers who want to work on the system, as well as corporate companies that want to also have a channel to participate constructively with the community. And that's where the Linux Foundation comes in. We have a very nice structure that allows different participants to engage with the community meaningfully and at a level that makes sense for them. So first off, we have all these meetups and community events where anybody is free to come and just learn about the community, meet folks and things like that. But if you want to get a little more engaged, if you want to start making technical contributions, then we have the technical steering committee, which essentially runs the project, both in terms of figuring out what a long-term roadmap is, as well as defining how folks can contribute to the project. So you can contribute as an individual contributor, you can take ownership of parts of it as a committer, and you can also become a TSC member if you want to engage with the community at that level. And this is all free. There are no obligations. You just have to participate, show up, and make your contributions. And finally, if you want to engage with us as a corporate entity, then we also have a governing board. The governing board allows you to make tax-free contributions to the Linux Foundation. And then we use the proceeds that we raise through membership dues to organize these events and to spread the word about the community and empower folks like Tim and others who are doing great work in the TSC. So we are an open community, we're very welcoming. People can come and engage with us at different levels, and we'd love to have you over.
Awesome. Thanks, Girish. Okay, let's dive into what I think people are most excited to hear about, the meat of the presentation. What are the details of the data stacks at Uber and Meta? So not even going into the details yet around like Presto and what it's doing, but just at a high level overview, Tim, what is the data stack like that you're working on at Meta?
So I think if you were to sort of like, condensing it into its essence, it looks an awful lot like this Open Data Lake architecture. Like there is a scalable storage layer that essentially is used for, whatever purpose is needed. But there is, sort of like it's used, essentially it's made available to be used for however you can unlock value out of the data. So like that culture and concept is very important. And it all kind of like revolves around, getting data into there, and then, how do you get the data out of there? So there's, sort of like tools to ingest data into, this, sort of like storage layer. Then there's also tools to, query it. Obviously there's Presto. So there's, like tools to do interactive analytics, exploratory analytics, dashboards, experimentation and that sort of stuff. But then also tools more ML oriented, and sort of like also we use a Spark in conjunction with Presto on the batch side. So I think like at a very high level, it's really sort of like similar as to like what you would see from a data lakehouse. And I think the reasoning for that is simple. It's just sort of like as you scale, it's a very scalable architecture. And so, like it allows you to consolidate investments, and, sort of like help you sort of scale as your organization and as your data needs scale along with it. It gives you multiple options to grow with those parameters. Great.
And Girish, I'll move over onto you. I know that, both Uber and Meta have shared a lot about their use cases, specifically with Presto, and both have some pretty impressive numbers. Girish, maybe you can share a little bit more about high level what your stack looks like, and then we can kind of drill into what Presto is doing for you.
Absolutely. So as Tim mentioned, I think our data stack is also structured very similarly to the diagram you showed earlier. We are also based largely on open source technologies. So we have data coming in through our ingestion pipelines, which largely route them through Kafka. We then have this data landing in HDFS, which is what we use for our open data lake. And then on top of that, we have a layer of transactions called Hoodie that we built in-house at Uber. So this gives us functionality like upserts and things like that. So you have data freshness, basically. And then we have Spark jobs, which do ETL. We use Hive on Spark. Again, innovations coming out of Meta to process our data for querying. And then we have Presto and Spark eventually from consumers. So it's largely Presto for the long tail of users and Spark for some core business use cases like machine learning, heavy data processing, and so forth.
Great. And then we'd be remiss not to talk about how Presto is really being used at scale. So maybe going one level deeper, Girish, what kinds of workloads are you running with Presto, or what are the use cases that Presto is powering at Uber?
Sure. So in terms of sheer numbers, we're talking about thousands of machines, at least 10 plus clusters. We have at least 6,000 to 7,000 weekly active users, way more monthly. At least half the company uses Presto once a month to do their job. And we're talking about like at least 500,000 queries a day. And these are all very complex queries, right? So these are people trying to get reports, do analysis, data prep, all kinds of workloads. So that is purely in terms of scale. But then one of the other interesting things about Uber is that we are a very operations-driven company, right? So if you think about our business, we have a lot of presences across a lot of cities, and each of these presences work as sort of independent business units, right? They have to work with the local regulatory authorities, they have to work with local partners and so forth. And so one of the main things that they need to conduct their business is insights that they get from our data. And so they are all consumers of Presto. They need to run daily, weekly, monthly reports. They need to do analysis, product insights, all kinds of stuff, right? And so this is where Presto is really key to business success at Uber.
That's great. And that's some pretty impressive numbers you shared. So Tim, I'll go back over to you if you want to drill more into, how Meta is using Presto and some of the use cases that it's powering there.
Yeah, I think firstly, like you can consider, sort of like the bread and butter use cases that Presto is, very well known for, including exploratory analytics, dashboards, and sort of like data analysis. Obviously, like Presto is sort of like the tool of choice for these types of use cases. If it's within this sort of like data lake, you would almost certainly use Presto for these types of use cases. Other use cases, though, are, could be different than how you typically think about it. The first is, like we use Presto very extensively for batch at a very high scale. And so like in terms of the volume, it's the majority of queries that are, sort of executed in batch end up going to Presto. And so we do this through a combination of techniques. The first is, we have dedicated clusters purely for batch, optimized, for throughput for batch. But then also, like we've invested, sort of like heavily in batch-oriented technologies within Presto itself, including large batch mode, which disaggregates the shuffle and gives Presto a more scalable batch-oriented shuffle, and also some unit of recoverability, and then also Presto on Spark, where the Presto execution engine is sort of like executing within the Spark distributed execution. So that gives us the recoverability, task and stage level recoverability, in addition to very flexible and scalable shuffle. And so, like Presto is very popular for batch use cases because the whole, sort of like idea of testing out your query interactively, developing your pipeline without having to wait for, slow tools is very powerful. So, sort of like with a very extremely common use case is sort of just writing the pipeline code in some way that allows you to sort of like get some intermittent analysis, and then simply shipping it over to batch after running it through a testing engine. And so like people love Presto for that because it just sort of like makes that whole process much smoother. Some other use cases include experimentation. So we use Presto to power an internal experimentation platform. And then also internal applications. So like we make Presto available to, uses that we really don't predict. And so it's just sort of like as a way to make data available for specific purposes. Presto is also available programmatically to other internal tools.
Great, a ton of innovation obviously going on, and thanks for sharing all those details, Tim. So wrapping up here, I know we're getting close to time. Tim, I'll start with you. What is, as the chair of the TSC, the Presto Foundation TSC, what does the future look like for the open source project? I mean, is there anything exciting you can share, or maybe some of the latest innovation going on in the open source project?
I think the way I would describe it is unification. So, we're very focused on unifying Presto to be the best default tool that you have available in sort of like your collection of tools that exist out there. And so like there's a few specific ways that we're focusing on that. The first one, as I already mentioned, is Presto on Spark. Like we're really investing heavily in making sure that that's extremely reliable and sort of like supports Spark's very battle tested and proven ability to handle extremely large batch workloads. So like the goal is like you don't have to reach for another tool because of like the Presto's MPP based execution engine can't handle a particular shape or something. So basically, as your data scales, we want Presto to scale with it. And then the second is sort of like in the opposite direction is really focusing on the native worker. And so what I mean by that is, focusing on, rewriting a lot of the fundamental aspects of the Presto execution engine in C++ and focusing on, like very efficient native execution, for the SQL operators and sort of like the Presto worker. And so what this will unlock is not having to use a different tool at the other end. So like we see extremely impressive performance benefits and efficiency benefits by moving to the native worker. Which I hope to be able to share more of soon. But by focusing on the native worker and leveraging hierarchical caching, the idea is that you don't have to reach for a different tool when we get into the millisecond range queries. Presto is also a terrific tool for that scale as well.
Awesome.
And then on top of these two things, it's finally like bringing Presto to as one tool that supports many use cases is focusing on the reliability and multi-tenancy of Presto. So making sure that Presto fields these different requests in a way that's extremely reliable and sort of like can scale with the amount of use cases that go into the single engine.
Great. I think we have about a minute left to wrap up. Girish, I'll leave it with you for final thoughts from a foundation perspective or even an Uber perspective. What does the future hold for Presto?
Absolutely. I'll start with the foundation. I think the foundation has been doing great work, particularly through both the TSC, chaired by Tim, and the outreach committee chaired by Yuali. I think we've done a great job giving a forum for folks to share all the great innovations that are happening at Meta, Uber, and other places, a lot of which Tim described here. We're looking forward to more and more participation. We have a PrestoCon Day coming up, which is again a great forum for folks to come and see what's going on and to meet the people who are working within the depths of Presto, right? So these are the real experts, and it's a great forum to meet everyone. With regards to Presto itself, I'll say one thing. So I think a lot of what Tim described sounded more to me like a platform rather than a tool. And I think that's the direction that the Presto community is going, right? SQL as a platform. Basically, don't just think of SQL as or Presto as just one tool for your job. Think of it as a different way of doing things, right? Using SQL to solve your problems instead of programming languages. It's a paradigm shift. And I think the Presto community and foundation is at the forefront. So we have lots of talks which go into those ideas in much more detail. See you all at PrestoCon Day.
Great. Well, thank you, Girish and Tim. This was an excellent panel, and I hope everybody learned something about Presto today. It is open source. Highly recommend check it out. Join the Presto Slack channel. We're all there hanging out and ready and able to help when you're ready to get started. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Girish, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Tim. See you all.